Hello, everyone. Welcome to this webinar on BMP's latest report, Trading Glass Ceilings for Glass Cliffs. So we had over 800 people register for this webinar, which is great. And I'm seeing some people are already putting their greetings in the chat, which is great to see. Thanks for doing that, folks. Let's start. I just wanted to start out by welcoming everyone to this webinar conversation. We're talking today about BMP's latest report, which we titled Trading Glass Ceilings for Glass Cliffs. And we will also have a conversation with three Black nonprofit leaders about how the insights from the report reflect their experience. And I also want to take a moment to acknowledge what's happening in the world and the global context that has dominated the news for the past few days. Our thoughts are with the people of Ukraine and with Ukrainian Americans here in the US. And we're also thinking about people across the globe impacted by war and violence who are seeking refuge and protection. And as an organization, BMP expresses our solidarity with social movements here and abroad in support of the rights of immigrants and refugees. And we just understand that the news is affecting everybody joining right now in a lot of ways, and just wanted to extend our care and support. As folks are engaging in this conversation, I just want to acknowledge that you're not visible, but you are welcome to use the chat function, both to send tech issues to BMP, and also if you want to share your experiences, feel free to do so through chat. Also want to invite people to share your reactions and experiences using social media, and you can see the Race Lead hashtag at the bottom of this slide. This webinar is being recorded. We'll share the link along with additional materials probably next week. And I'm going to invite folks to use the Q&A function if you want to ask questions of the speakers rather than the chat, just because it's easier for the BMP team to sort and track questions that have been answered using that function. So with all of that being said, I want to just express my excitement about this conversation, the opportunity to review the findings and have this panel conversation with Karundi Williams from Repower, Margaret Mitchell from YWCA USA, and Prentiss from the Ohio Organizing Collaborative. You'll hear from all of them shortly. I want to start with a little bit of background on BMP. We're a national organization that develops research, tools, training, opportunities for partnership to bolster nonprofit organizations of the sector to support the voice and power of the people served by organizations. And since our founding over 20 years ago, BMP has been focused on these three main areas: movement building, particularly the current work around solidarity and transformational solidarity, the potential for that to help organizations and movements work collaboratively to have bigger impact than they might be able to on their own. Working with direct service organizations to embrace social change values and practices, and particularly to tap the voice and power of their constituency. And then the leadership work. And the leadership work for the past several years has focused on racial gaps. And we launched this Race to Lead initiative back in 2016 with a survey that more than 4,000 nonprofit employees responded to. The data led to this first series of reports, some of which were looking at the data through particular demographic lenses, so LGBT folks of color, women of color, EDCOs. Some of the follow-up reports were looking at it from the perspective of particular states where we'd reached a critical mass and had significant partners on the ground who had been really key to pushing out the survey link. In 2019, we resurveyed the nonprofit field, and more than 5,000 employees participated in the survey effort that time. And thanks to partnership with groups across the country, we were able to release not just this report, Trading Glass Ceilings for Glass Cliffs, but the Race to Lead Revisited report and a series of local briefs looking at how the sector looks in particular places where, again, we had deep partnerships and our partners on the ground were able to ensure a robust sample. I want to pause here so that we can do some polls just to get a sense of who's joining us today. The first poll is about your role. And so the question is, what best describes your role? And you can select whether you're an ED CEO or any of these other roles, as well as consultant or capacity builder, funder, or other. I'm just going to give it a few more seconds for more folks to fill out the poll, given that we have 300 people who have joined us for the webinar right now. Let's see. Catherine, whenever it looks like we've reached critical mass, feel free to show the results. All right, so over a quarter of folks on the webinar today are EDs and CEOs, which is great. It's also not surprising given that this report does focus on the experiences of EDs and CEOs. And so I want to invite those of you who are EDs and CEOs to help inform another research project that BMP is doing right now. It is a survey of executive leaders of nonprofits that we have underway right now that's looking at the capacity building supports that executive leaders need, both to support their organizations and their own leadership. And my colleague is putting a link in the chat to a page that will provide a little bit more information. But the invitation is for those of you who are EDs and CEOs to participate in that survey effort and inform this other research project that BMP is taking on right now. The second poll, it should be coming up on your screen. And it's about your familiarity with our resources and how you have used the Race to Lead series. And you can select more than one answer here. Maybe to validate experience, to make the case for change within your organization or within other organizations, as part of your own writing or research, or maybe you haven't really used the reports much or didn't know about the series before this report was released. And again, we have over 300 people who are on the line right now, so we're just going to give a few more seconds for folks to fill out this poll before moving on. All right, and what do the responses look like? All right, so a lot of folks didn't know much about the Race to Lead initiative. So welcome to being able to use these reports, because it does look like many folks are using the reports and resources to make the case for change, which really is great for us to hear and know. We also know that the reports do provide a lot of validation for people. And so if you are an ED CEO of color and you read the report and there was some recognition that some of what's being talked about through the data is reflective of your own experience, you are not crazy and you are not alone in having these experiences. So I'm going to move us on to digging into the report findings, and you can see the 5 main findings here. And I want to acknowledge that the title of the report is, again, Trading Glass Ceilings for Glass Cliffs. And those terms have a particular origin, right? The term glass ceiling is now well known, but it was originally coined to describe career barriers faced by women in corporate sectors. And you can see this quote is a definition from a bipartisan federal commission from 1995. Well, 10 years later, the glass cliff term was coined. And it was coined by researchers in England because they had a key insight that women and people of color were getting the opportunity to lead companies, particularly at a point, or at exactly the point when those companies were experiencing some kind of crisis, which then meant that those leaders were particularly vulnerable to being judged negatively, but that was largely because they had inherited circumstances in the company that made those jobs very precarious and risky. And so we wanted to just acknowledge the origin of both of those terms so that you also had some context for what we mean when we're talking about glass cliffs in the nonprofit sector. The first finding from the report was that leaders of color need supports, not more training. And this quote that you'll see on your screen really helps to illustrate this piece around the desire and need for supports. And one of the supports in particular relates to institutional sponsors. But I want to just pause and give a little bit of data context, because basically half of EDs and CEOs of color reported their race had negatively impacted their advancement in the nonprofit sector. And that is similar to the data provided by people of color who are not in ED CEO roles. But it's just worth acknowledging that people are overcoming a lot before they get into these top roles. And one of those barriers is this lack of institutional sponsors who are lobbying on their behalf. And the way that we've tried to get at this idea of institutional sponsors is that sponsors are often mentors in senior positions in the organization that people work for, who will advocate for their mentees' professional advancement. And so in the survey, we try to distinguish between whether people report that they've had mentors at their job who provided that kind of support versus mentors outside of their job. And so you can see here, the blue bar at the top is EDs and CEOs of color who reported that they had mentors at their previous jobs that provided advice, support, connections. And that is 11 percentage points lower than the percent of white EDs and CEOs who reported that they had received that kind of institutional support. There is no effective difference, though, between EDs of color and white EDs in terms of whether they had mentors outside of their organization. So that more informal mentorship that may not always lead to advancement within an organization. And one of the ways that we think that leaders are compensating for the lack of access to institutional sponsors is a higher reliance on executive coaching. So that's what you see in the bottom pair of bars, where 59% of EDs of color reported that they have received coaching or executive coaching, compared to 49% of white EDs. And so that 10 percentage point gap, we think, is how people are compensating for the lack of access to sponsors. But it's worth remembering that executive coaching is something that leaders are often paying for, whereas mentorship and sponsorship is something that is provided voluntarily by people who are senior to you in organizations or in the sector. It's also worth noting this piece around needing support, but not more training. And you can see with both of these data points that there's no real difference between EDs of color and white EDs in terms of whether they had received financial training on financial management and budgeting or training on fundraising. And the reason we want to highlight this is because it's just another reminder that there is no basis for funders to have less trust in leaders of color when it comes to fiscal management. But we know from our data and from what we hear anecdotally that leaders of color still encounter these barriers in terms of trust from their funders, access to resources from funders, and the ability to build relationships with funders. So again, training is not one of the shortcomings. It is not an issue. It's really the bias of funders and the nonprofit sector more broadly. So the second finding is that leaders of color take on added burdens without additional compensation. And if these findings are resonating with you, just want to remind you to use the Race to Lead hashtag and tag us in your posts on anything that's coming up as you're hearing these findings and reading these reports. But I'm going to start with another quote. And this quote is from a survey respondent who is providing an example of the added financial barriers that leaders of color often have to take on to ascend to these top leadership roles. And the point that he's making around extra credentials, further education and development, it was particularly true for leaders of color who followed a white predecessor. So 70% of EDs of color with a white predecessor reported having a master's degree or some other terminal degree. And that was roughly 10 percentage points higher than both other leaders of color as well as white EDs and CEOs overall. And so it's just a sad reminder of the adage that you have to be twice as good to get half as far as a person of color. And once people get to the top job, they're still reporting more challenges and frustrations, as shown here in this figure, where you can see consistently this gap between the blue bar for EDs and CEOs of color and the umber bar for white EDs, CEOs, where EDs and CEOs of color are more likely to report being often or always frustrated by lack of role models, lack of social capital and networks. It's somewhat ironic, but leaders of color are also more likely to be often or always frustrated by the stress of being called on to push DEI in their organizations. I want to then focus this also on these salary and compensation issues. So this issue around salary not being high enough is one where that is, the one where leaders of color are expressing the most frustration out of these measures. And it's also worth noting that the gap is also particularly large when it comes to feeling that people are being paid less than colleagues for the same work, so that leaders of color feel like they're being paid less than peer EDs and CEOs. Moving on to the third finding, it looks at identity-based organizations and the added pressures on leaders of color of this type of nonprofit organization. And so this visual is showing two pie charts showing the percentage of EDs, white EDs on the right, on the left EDs of color, based on whether they reported that their organization was an identity-based nonprofit. So one focusing on particular racial ethnic communities, immigrant communities, LGBTQ+ communities, etc. So you can see that over half of leaders of color are leading that type of organization compared to only 22% of white EDs. And it was interesting to see that there were some cases where EDs of identity-based organizations, whether they were people of color or white, were more similar in contrast with EDs of organizations that were not identity-based. For instance, 84% of EDs of color and 82% of white EDs leading identity-based organizations reported they were often or always frustrated with their demanding workloads. And that was in comparison to around 3/4 of both leaders of color and white EDs of more mainstream organizations. So that's just one example. It was also true when it came to the frustrations around pay, things like that. This is a quote that helps to illustrate one of the particular challenges that leaders of identity-based organizations experience related to building relationships with funding sources. So nearly half of EDs of color leading identity-based organizations reported they were often or always frustrated by the lack of relationship with funding sources. That was compared to both leaders of color leading more mainstream organizations, as well as white leaders of identity-based organizations and white leaders of more mainstream organizations. Moving on to the fourth finding, there are some unique challenges that come with taking over leadership from a white predecessor. And what we're showing with this figure is just how many EDs of color followed a white predecessor. It's almost half in our sample. And this reminds us of another report that BMP put out earlier in the fall called Making or Taking Space. But one of the key insights related to the particular challenges that come with taking over leadership from white predecessors from that other report was that boards are often nowadays selecting leaders of color to address or clean up some DEI issues that exiting white leaders have not been able to resolve, which is one of the key drivers of that experience of moving into executive leadership for people of color becoming a glass cliff situation, because they both have to do the internal DEI organizational culture change work and also sustain and advance the organization in an environment where there often is not sufficient support and funding for the organizations, particularly when the organization is led by a person of color. The last finding is that the responsibility for transforming organizations in advance of those transitions is too often not being taken up by white leaders. And as this figure shows, around half of the ED's CEOs we surveyed were potentially transitioning out of their leadership roles. Either they were thinking about transitioning or they already had plans underway. And that it was interesting that this was true for both white EDs as well as leaders of color. And we know that there have been other times in the past when the sector sort of panicked about a wave of executive transitions, but it really does seem like a transition is really taking place in the sector. And it's just really important for us to be making sure that race is being considered and planned for as a part of the transition planning of organizations. And here is one quote from a participant in a focus group around, the importance of not just getting a person of color into that next leadership role, but making sure that that person has the support they need to succeed. So again, that leaders of color are not set up with a glass cliff situation. So that's all 5 of the findings from the report, and I'm going to pause here for another poll question before we transition to the panel conversation. The poll question is, which of the areas below do you think pose the biggest management challenge for leaders of color? Is it board relations, DEI, funding, HR, strategy, mission, capacity, infrastructure? Just want to get a read on what people are seeing or experiencing as the biggest management challenges. All right, let's see if we've got results from the poll. Yeah, sorry, there is not an all of the above option at this point. All right, so funding, a third of you are identifying funding as a particular barrier facing EDs of color, followed by board relations, and then capacity and infrastructure, which might be a good reason for us to put the link to that survey about nonprofit capacity and infrastructure that we're doing with EDs back into the chat. Thanks so much. All right, so I want to now transition into the panel discussion and invite Karundi, Prentiss, and Margaret to start coming on video. And I'm gonna start us off by trying to have a little bit of a conversation around, we often think about the complications and struggles of leadership in just like really personal terms. Maybe it's a relationship with a particular board member or staff person, or it's about that one grant that doesn't get renewed. But I wanna try to get us to have a bigger picture view on some of the trends and systemic forces, particularly as they impact Black leaders in the nonprofit sector and Black-led organizations. And so Karundi, as you saw, this piece around funding and access to financial resources really is this frustration, particularly we know for Black-led nonprofits. Curious what you're seeing as potentially making a real difference in the way that funding flows to nonprofits led by Black folks and people of color, and how can we as grant seekers move our funders to be more racially just?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for this report and for having this conversation. And I appreciate that question. And I have to say, I have to answer it 2 ways. One, there's not a lot of changes that we're seeing in terms of funding flowing to Black-led organizations. I looked at this report from 2018 from Philanthropic Initiative for Racial Equity, and I'm happy to share that in the chat box, that found that only 6% of philanthropic dollars goes to racial equity work and only 1% go to racial justice work. And this is like post-Obama, right? Like everybody assumed that all of a sudden, because we had a Black president, we saw this like big wave of EDs of color and leaders of color coming in and taking over organizations, that all of a sudden we were going to see this like more resources flowing towards racial equity work and racial justice work, and also to Black leaders. And that's actually not true. And really thinking about even in 2020, when we saw the racial uprising, and there's a lot of sort of data trying to point towards all of these resources flowing into this area of work. And I don't think the numbers are telling the real story, because we're still lagging really far behind in terms of money coming towards Black-led organizations and organizations doing racial justice work. So to just frame my answer by saying, there isn't a whole lot of difference that I am seeing. But as a Black leader and having taken over an organization that was previously white-led and had gone through a lot of transition, some of the lessons I can share in terms of what I've learned and what I think can make a difference is, one, in philanthropy, we are seeing a lot of people of color, program offices of color, more Black women in leadership roles within philanthropy. And I think that could make a huge difference, and that trend has to continue. And I think as a movement, we need to figure out a strategy that puts more people that look like us in these rooms that are making decisions about resources flowing to organizations that are Black-led and to work that is racial justice or racial equity. So that's one way I think we could see a difference. And I've seen small differences and changes because of that. So that's one thing. And then I think as leaders, and I can speak from my experience, having unapologetic, authentic conversations with funders is really important. Like I was not shy about saying what exactly that I needed. And there's an approach about calling in your funder partners to really partner with you in a really deep way to support what it is that you're trying to build. There is a lot of conversation in philanthropy right now about supporting racial justice work and supporting Black leaders. And I think there's an accountability in that we need to ask is like, how are you actually living into these big statements of support, right, for people of color, et cetera. So I think for me, some of the ways that has worked for me is having really genuinely honest and unapologetic conversation and asking for exactly what I need and not being shy about it. You know, and as a newer ED, I've been 2.5 years in the role, I was a little shy and uncomfortable, right, at the beginning. And now I just go in and say, this is what I need. This is what the work is going to take to resource. And then therefore, this is my ask. So I think that has made a big difference. And I do think letting some funders go, to be honest with you, I came in to an organization that had funders who supported our work for a long time. And a lot of them were in the wait and see posture to see what I was going to do, et cetera, et cetera. And after a while, I just didn't spend a whole lot of time trying to convince them to come along with me, right? So making a strategic decision at some point about where you want to spend your time and energy with funders who actually are values aligned and really committed to doing that work and being real with them, and also releasing people and not chasing, right? Because I had to make that call and be like, okay, we've tried to engage you 3 or 4 times, and at this point, we're just going to let that go. So I think having those type of strategies and approaches has really worked well for me, at least.
Thank you so much. And there's a lot of response in the chat as you were speaking. It really resonated with folks. And I'm going to shift to a different sort of systemic force that I do think is impacting organizations in the sector, which relates to, I think, our movement culture and some of the expectations around what it means to hold leadership. And so Prentiss, you're part of, a younger generation of nonprofit leaders who are moving into executive roles at this same time that it seems like there's increasing skepticism about formal leadership There seems like there's increasing distrust of hierarchy. And curious, how are you carrying out some of the difficult decisions and day-to-day responsibilities that are just involved in running an organization, but doing it in a way that's in light of and responsive to and aligned with our values and beliefs as a progressive movement?
Well, for one, wow, that's a huge question. And thank you for having me here to have this discussion. I actually kind of want to flip the question a little bit because I think we kind of pigeonhole ourselves when we talk about sort of a new generation stepping in, that they don't want hierarchy, they don't want structure. Let's actually take it back a couple of generations. If we look at the sort of boomer generation, the folks in the middle of the civil rights movement who literally like paved an entire new way of how we could demand for and fight for justice in this country. They did that. And then the generation immediately after that, the Xers were instituting that new path forward. And then we look in the millennials, the age of the internet, the way that the Obama age, who created a new way in which we could imagine how we could connect and have belonging and move in the world. And now we're in this Zoomer, this Generation Z generation that is trying to institute a new institution. I think what we actually need to talk about is not that young people are against institutions. They're trying to reimagine new social institutions that meet the need of how we actually meet each other and connect with each other in the 21st century. And so when I stepped into this role, I think I've been blessed, maybe because I have an angel on my back or something, that I feel like my brain works in multiple different ways where I can live in the moment and see what's happening in terms of what's happening in the field, but also understand the history and the legacy of what people have left behind. And the sort of challenge is existing in those two worlds and people trusting that you can be a steward of taking the best lessons of what we've learned about institutions in the past and be unafraid of innovation moving forward. And like everything you said, when a person of color steps into that role, folks get hesitant of, can they steward the information we've known before and create way for innovation? And so what I've been able to see in this role is that I have to be the steward of innovation. I have to be the person that has the calm, steady hand to sort of even hospice things that no longer serve us out. And when you are in that leadership and young, you have to have a wise soul to move those things forward. But wisdom comes from listening and seeing where you can get a kernel of truth from everyone who is putting something in. And so there have been nights where I've just felt like I didn't know a path. But every time that I sat back and listened to everything that I hear from everyone that is invested in me, invested in the organization I'm trying to co-lead with my co-director, I've been able to grow. So that's what I'm thinking about. I think it actually takes wise leadership, and wise leadership is not about age. It's about the ability to listen and see what's out there in the world and bring in the best things that it's your God-given gift to put out there.
Thanks so much. And I'm seeing a lot of, again, traffic in the chat. And I think, identifying what are those practices that you've hospiced out, might be interesting to just like share with folks. Like, what are the list of organizational practice to send to hospice care?
I mean, so I'll talk about hospice and stewarding. So the hospice is literally like taking a gentle hand to allow people to allow what no longer serves the organization to leave. Part of what I've learned about human nature and leading is that no one wants to feel like they no longer are valued or what their contribution is doesn't matter anymore. And that's not necessary. Actually, what I believe is necessary as leaders is to put in front of someone the vision and a direction and an authentic invitation to walk into it. And if you want to walk into it, there's investment for you and a path for you. If you don't, you can walk away because you actually have agency. And so to me, the hospicing is actually about reminding people of their agency and not stripping them of it. And so that's what it's taken a long time because we're so conditioned to not think we have agency. I have to remind people that you always have agency inside of this. You can say yes or no, and that is true. And that's helped hospice some of the things out. And also while you're hospicing, you have to also be laying the foundations for a new culture. And that's where the stewarding helps, because you bring some of the old pieces in, you bring in new pieces. And then the third part of this, after you hospice, steward, is then you have to midwife the new. You have to literally allow the rebirth in the organization to come. And that birth is something that has to be grown and invested and tended to. And what I've seen is that over the last 2 years, even in the beginning of this year in my organization, I've seen what I've midwife come to life. And every other thing that had to happen before had to happen, from the hospicing and the stewarding, for us to actually birth new life. And it takes the time that it takes.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Prentiss. I want to move us on to talking just a little bit more about some of the results from the survey, because it really does demonstrate that there's this variety of added burdens falling on leaders of color, particularly when it comes to leading identity-based organization. And so, Margaret, as the CEO of YWCA USA, which is a historic network that is very large, and the associations across 200 communities, feminist, longstanding commitment to eliminating racism. So, what are the things that you have seen in terms of the added struggles for the network, but also particularly for women of color as they ascend into leadership roles of those types of organizations?
Sean, how can I have to comment on what has been said? I mean, this has been just an incredible conversation. First of all, I am always appreciative of Building Movement Project. It is very affirming, the data. I can remember landing and discovering this work in 2016, 2017, and the validation was so powerful for me. And to see this work, which centers on me, I am not an afterthought. I can see my voice, I can see myself, and I can begin to use it in a variety of ways. The way I mentor, the way I build scaffolding, the way I help funders to understand all of that. This is not a feeling. And I was told before that I was just having feelings. And now to be able to validate it all is really just absolutely incredible. I just loved Karundi's comments, and I am just so absolutely, grounded in her unapologetic. Everybody is not going to be for you. And we just can twist ourselves into doing things for funders that harm our work, harm our soul, and harm our outcomes. And so we're looking, you don't want anybody that don't want you. End of story. And since I'm probably the only one that has had 3 children with a midwife here at home, I love that. And birthing at home with a midwife, there's this incredible ability that grows and happens over the months that develops the agency. It's not that you're going to stay home in the middle of an emergency if something is going wrong. You're empowered to constantly make those decisions. And that was what Prentiss was talking about, setting the table and inviting people to come into the frame and make choice. And I think that that is incredible. The way we build our internal organizations is going to be a reflection, right? And our work, our culture of our organizations is always built in the shadow of the leader. And so inside, it's what is happening inside that really is, the quality of the work. And I think, being able always to think about, I've been, since coming to USA, I came January 3rd of 2022. You knew me, Sean, in my previous role, in Cleveland. I remember, sending a note to you in December, like, I'm going to USA, will you don't leave me. And I think I've been chewing on this moment versus movement, right? We were all we're all in this around a movement. And we saw a moment, an important moment, but it's also really critical to understand how we keep going in this movement work. And it is about carrying as we climb. It is about understanding the data. It is about being unapologetic. So as we hone our crafts, and as we continue, I love that inviting in is so really necessary. The grass tops, the tree tops, the structural pieces and the elements must change. We are often doing work, and a dear friend of me, Dr. Art James, would always say, we're handing somebody who's having a heart attack a Band-Aid. And it really, because we are on the ground doing this work, we can be helpful around when and where money could better be used. And if you're going to do this work in grass tops, what influence are you going to use in the structures also to be able to make change? Because philanthropy has an important role to play in the systems. It is a system. It was built by a system. And when we are not pushing, hey, I'm going to do this, I'm going to have outcomes. What are you doing? We're all in this together. Is this about you feeling good, or is this about us moving forward? And so all of that is in there as we think about creating and sustaining a movement versus a moment.
Thanks so much, Margaret. And I'm going to invite all of us to come off of mute, because we're going to start moving into some of the questions that are coming in, because there's a lot of interest in how, like what the role is of the board, but also how you are, negotiating or managing board dynamics as well. And I think part of what's interesting about the three of you is, differing organizational models in terms of organizing, advocacy and training, services, and yet this like consistency in this commitment to our communities. And so curious, like what do your boards look like, or what are your observations about what it takes to have the board be fully supportive? And if you inherited a board that was already on board, great. But I think people are looking for advice around how to shift their boards. Anyone have any insights on that? Go
Sure. I'm happy to start here. I have a terrific board, so I'm blessed in that regard, but I know that's not necessarily true for every ED and CEO. My board and my organization started really transitioning around the same time. So when we were rebranding and renaming, we were once Wellstone Action, our original founding board really started transitioning at the same time the organization was changing. And so a lot of my board members, when I joined Repower as the ED in 2019, a lot of the board had also changed and was changing during my transitioning in. So I have been blessed with an incredible supportive board. But one thing I have found or advice I can share is really defining your relationship with your board when you arrive, right? Like having really candid conversations about what type of relationship you want to have. Oftentimes, I think new EDs may lean on their boards for direction or advice or thought partnership, right? Like there is and that's okay. And if that's what you need as an executive director, then you should lean on your board to provide that, if that is the type of relationship you want with them. So having a conversation that sort of establishes what do you need and what type of relationship do you want to have feels important. I've read all these articles about, the board shouldn't get involved in your everyday sort of running of the organization. That is true. Like if you inherit a board that is all up in your business, like there is a conversation to be had about what is the role of the board versus your role, and how do you reset, that type of relationship. And I don't want to obviously offend anybody, but there is also a conversation to be had about transitioning people off your board, right? Like I had a board that had some founding members, and as we were changing as an organization, we wanted to attract different type of leaders in the movement because our work was also shifting. So how do you have conversations with your board about where you're going, what your direction, what is your vision for the organization, and what you're looking for in your board to support that, and what makeup that you believe will actually support the work in itself? Because let's not forget, this is about the work. And a lot of our organizations, both Margaret's organization and Prentiss, we have a particular kind of work that we're doing. So how are you defining, identifying the type of board that has expertise in the work that you do, that can bring that thought partnership to you and that support to you? So I think, just like I said, unapologetic, real, transparent, honest conversation that has to happen with your staff, with your funders, with your partners. Those conversations had to be had with your board as well. And I will also note one other thought here is that often boards, because of all of the transitioning of white leaders, and there's usually, leaders of color and Black leaders are being brought in to clean up after white leaders, there should be I think, support in the transition timeline, whether your transition is a year. As folks are transitioning internally, your board should be going through a process of how do I help ensure the organization is ready and prepared to support a new leader of color, because your organization, most organizations in our movement, is not ready internally for fellowship of a person of color. A Black woman can only speak as a Black woman. They're not ready for that. So what is the role of your board in engaging in the transition process to prepare the organization for the incoming leader? And how can you have a conversations with your funders to say, the org is going through a transition. This next year, we're going to go through a whole process. What is the role of supporting the board with consultants or whatever the case might be to take us on a journey to prepare all of us to be ready to set up a leader of color for success? And if that didn't happen before you get there, what is the process in the first year of your tenure, right? To really partner with your board to get ready for all that. So those are some of my thoughts.
Thanks. And Margaret, I'm curious if you have any other thoughts about boards, whether from previous organizations you've led or what you're seeing in the network. But I also see a question that came into the Q&A around how do you navigate imposter syndrome? And it's a question that I've asked you directly in the past, so I just wanted to pose it publicly, in addition to any thoughts you have on the board dynamics.
Boards are an important part of our work. And so our excellence around this, understanding the psychology of boards, often means really deeply understanding racialized trauma, the racialized trauma of the Black body and the racialized trauma of the white body, because it does show up in our boards. We're not just counting who's on a board, but we are taking them on a journey. And when we are leading equity organizations, we want our board, some board members will come with that. Most, regardless of the body they are in, will not. And it is part of our role to continue to peel back how inequities live in our policies and practices that have been established by the board. It is an ongoing process. So you are bringing along the equity, the racial equity of the board. At YWCA, we do a virtual challenge. And we invite board members, I usually invite board members year one to do it as an option, as I did today with our national governing board. And then in year two, it is mandated. And then in year three, you're inviting vendors, and then you're mandating vendors, right? You bringing everybody along, as well as your staff in your organization. And so it is not. We are so conditioned. We're so conditioned. We are unbrainwashing. We are unwinding our own crazy tapes in our brain. We are dismantling worldviews, regardless of the body you're in. And that has to happen, for boards. And I like to do what I call a coffee connection, which is an informal gathering outside of the board meeting, because the board meeting is really about the business of the board. And you might be meeting one-on-one with board members, but you want that forming and norming and storming to happen. You want to hear from those voices. And so I use what I call a coffee connection to do those things and to have crucial conversations, to grow together, to be able to examine things and then ask the question, do you think this is causing harm? Could we do it differently? And so you begin to think about everything. It means that if you are a Black CEO and your compensation has been measured against other African-American CEOs, as a woman, you might say, I want to be measured against every white male CEO and see what their compensation is against mine. Could that be the new policy that we have? And you just keep growing. But oftentimes you've got to lay down, you got to keep laying down this groundwork in the approach to be able to get there. And that is when the science and the art, the excellence of who we are and what we do comes into play. It's a different game that we have to play as executive directors of color. It's a different game.
Yeah, so such a great point around like the unlearning, the reconditioning, and Karundi said, like, sometimes you do have to let board members go. And there is some like data informed research that for board transitions to really be effective, the tipping point is a third of the board changing, right? Like that, it's not that you actually change the whole board. It's just like that third. So if as a leader, you can bring in new board members so that you have that third tipping point, it can accelerate the progress so that all of the things that Margaret's talking about in terms of shifting culture can happen on a faster timeline. Mm-hmm. Margaret, I want to make sure that you can share some of the wisdom around the imposter syndrome, because I had asked you about it previously and you had such great insights about how you had supported women of color when you were at YWCA Cleveland to understand, but also rethink some of the issues around imposter syndrome that they were expressing as your staff members.
Yeah, I actually don't remember what I said, but I will say that, what I say typically to my team and young staffers is you do you. You can't ever be an imposter of you. It's just not physically possible.
That's what you
and
said.
So the more you continue to like you, to be in you, to be in the body, and to begin to lose less of what you think. When you come prepared, all of those imposter syndromes, it's just a trap. It's just a trap that we often allow that tape to be playing. And as it plays, we have to often learn how to use it for us and not against us. And so there's certainly, I could never say that I didn't struggle. But as I have continued to grow over the years in being comfortable with who I am, and that is always just about that intellectual curiosity around discovery and discovery of yourself. So I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly what I said.
That was it. You can't be an imposter of you. Prentiss, there was a question that came in. If you could talk a little bit more about some of the leadership practices. I think there's interest in shared leadership, the fact that you have a co-director, any other ways that the OOC is like rethinking or reenacting leadership in ways that may differ from what we're seeing as traditional structures.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just loving everything everyone is saying. And so I think a couple of different things. One, I believe in a co-director model because it builds in accountability and trust. I really believe that you have to move at the speed of trust. And by the fact that I have a co-director where for one, this job is extremely isolated. There's just no way to it's just isolated. There's not other folks you really can talk to about it. Having another person who is sharing in the experience, in the load, is actually a way that we dismantle white supremacy. Is that there's never one person that is trying to change the world or move a thing. It's always a shared endeavor, historically and in the present. And so in terms of our organization, a couple things I would say. One, we truly believe in an abundance of leadership. Truly in the abundance of leadership. I don't have a thought in my mind or a feeling in my body that every person that I choose to intentionally invest in cannot grow and be the best that they can be and offer something that grows all of our power.
Yeah.
I think too often we believe that we have to be a crabs in a bucket and figure out who's going to get to the top. But actually, crabs don't exist in buckets. They come out of the sea. So the fact that there needs to be no bucket, there is a place for all of us to grow who we are. And so our organization focuses on finding people who are ready and willing to be invested in. One of the things we tell our staff all the time is like, we don't expect you to be perfect here. We expect you to grow. If you are here and ready to grow and take the investment in the growth, you will be more than you could imagine yourself. And I think the other piece is that our work requires a deep level of self-mastery. You have to be reflective, understanding what are the things that come in your way? What are the things that show up? Like I have a white co-director. What are the stories that I tell myself about what it means to be a Black man leading with a white woman? And what has society told me about that? How can I figure out what that is in me so that I don't let that get in the way of the conversations we need to have, the way we need to lead together? How do I put shame, blame, and guilt to the side to be present for what is right in front of me and make choices there? And so the culture of our organization is where it is because we have modeled at the top of it that we're going to show vulnerability, that we're going to grow together, that we're going to be consistent. I think someone in the chat earlier said, people are against structure. People are not against structure. Folks want structured lives, but they want the structure to meet the needs of where they are. And so we have structures that meet the needs of where people are. And then when we say we invest in you, we really mean it. We coach, we do professional development, we have mental health services, but more importantly, because we believe in you, this is the thing about investment. You have to believe in the person you're investing in for you to challenge them to move forward. If you don't believe in them and you're trying to challenge them, that's not going to move them to the next level, because they need to know that you're going to stand shoulder to shoulder with them when you're running down that path together. Mm-hmm. So because our team knows that when I challenge and push you to your next level, I'm running that race with you, it allows for the walls from that corporate background or that person who tried to steal your job or that person who told you were not enough, that those stories don't have to exist here. Mm-hmm. We can actually make a new story and a new narrative. And so that's what I strive to do every day. And I know that I can't take people places I haven't been, which means I have to go there and interrogate that and meet every day. Because what I let out is as far and as the depth of which our organizations can go. And so I am so proud that we've been able to cultivate an environment where people trust that they can be vulnerable and grow here. What is life other than growth and change? What is it? If we can cultivate spaces of growth and change, we can accomplish whatever our mission is. But I'll stop there.
Well, I just want to thank all three of you for taking the time to have this conversation. It feels like we were just scratching the surface and probably need to figure out a way to respond to that demand for Prentiss to have his own podcast. And, it feels like there's a book of thoughts and ideas around how to lean into these organizational roles so that they are not quite as isolating and unsustainable as they have been. And so thanks to all of you for joining today's conversation. Thanks for everybody who was in the chat, and continue to look out for more information from BMP. And please don't just get on BMP's mailing list, also follow Repower, Ohio Organizing Collaborative, YWCA nationally and in your hometown. Please support all of these organizations and these leaders. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you
you.
for the co-leadership of BMP as well.
Yes.
Awesome. And I'm gonna just close with just sharing the screen so that those of you who want to do the capacity survey can see the link again. And yeah, we look forward to sharing the recording on by email for everyone who registered, as well as it'll go on our blog and YouTube channel. So you can revisit to hear more of the brilliant gems from Karundi, Margaret, and Prentiss. Thanks everybody for being with us today.